Warning: this podcast contains graphic content. Trigger warnings include descriptions of violence, torture, murder, and rape. Some episodes may include offenses against children. Please listen with caution, as this podcast is not meant for everyone. In 1959, 12-year-old Lynne Harper disappeared from the small town of Clinton, Ontario, after playing with friends at her school park. Her body was found days later, leading to a wave of confusion and suspicion that would haunt investigators and the families for years. What happened to this bright, innocent child? How did a routine evening transform into one of Canada's most notorious unsolved crimes? In this episode, we'll retrace the steps that led to Lynne Harper's disappearance, examine the clues that came to light, and the shocking twist that pointed the finger at a young boy named Stephen Truscott, only for doubts about his conviction to emerge. Was Stephen truly guilty, or was a wrongful conviction the tragic mistake that prevented justice for Lynne? This is Lynne's story. So grab your favorite mug, pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee, and join me as we dive into this mysterious case. I'm Shanda, and every week I'll take you through a deep dive into the dark shadows of true crime while sipping on our cup of joe. The weather outside is currently nice and sunny. We haven't seen sun in days, so I am just soaking it all in. This is Missing, Murdered, and Macchiatos. Cheryl Lynne Harper was born on August 31st, 1946, to Leslie and Shirley Harper. Cheryl often went by her middle name Lynn. She had one older brother named Barry and a younger brother named Jeffrey. Barry lived in Ohio, while Leslie, Shirley, Lynn, and Jeffrey lived on Canada's East Coast. Leslie was a flying officer in the military in New Brunswick, and he supported the family while Shirley stayed home to raise Lynn and Jeffrey. In July of 1957, when Lynn was just 10 years old, her father's job relocated the family to the Royal Canadian Air Force Base, or RCAF for short, which is 3 kilometers or 1.8 miles southeast of the town of Clinton, Ontario. The small town of Clinton is known for the RCAF base, where there was a top-secret school training military personnel in radar technology before it came out to the public. This base was abandoned in 1972, but is now a regular community and has since been renamed Vanastra. The population of Clinton back in 1957 was about 2,600 people, and the population of the RCAF base was about 3,000 at its peak. The family adjusted well to the move and their new home with a huge lawn. In 1959, 12-year-old Lynn enjoyed her free time in Girl Guides, at Sunday school, Bible class, sports, and spending time with her friends at the park on the base. Lynn and a friend would often climb the monkey bars and see how long they could hang upside down for. She was described as energetic, clean-cut, determined, and independent. She loved school even though the teachers would place her in a desk close by the teacher's desk so that they could attempt to keep her focused and on track. On Tuesday, June 9th, 1959, the province of Ontario was amidst a summer heatwave. Lynn attended school, then played baseball with some friends. At one point, Lynn hit the ball but couldn't run fast enough to make it to first base. Her friend then teased her to the point of upsetting her, and she decided to leave the game and walk home. She arrived home at about 5:30 p.m., just in time for supper. The Harper family enjoyed their supper, but Lynn got into it a bit with her parents because she wanted to go swimming at the RCAF swimming pool. But because she was only 12 years old, she needed an adult to supervise her or a pass to allow her to swim without a supervisor. Lynn left the house to go see if she could get a pass, but wasn't able to. When she got back home, she was clearly annoyed and frustrated, but started to do her chores anyway. Around 6:15 p.m., Lynne left again without telling Leslie or Shirley where she was going. Lynne took the 15-minute walk and ended up back at her school playground. She noticed there was a brownie meeting being held and went to help with the scavenger hunt. Lynne was in Girl Guides, which was just a few years older than the Brownie girls. The Brownies meeting finished around 7 p.m. So after the scavenger hunt, Lynne spoke with the lady running the Brownies course, explaining that she did not want to go because she got into a disagreement with her mom and dad. Around 7:05 p.m., Lynne started walking away from the group, who were getting ready to leave. She was excited to see her classmate and friend, 14-year-old Stephen Truscott, riding his green bike towards her. A few nights earlier at a teen get-together, she had asked Stephen to dance. Even though he was a little bit older than her, they were in a grade 7-8 split classroom. Stephen was a tall young man. He was well-liked and an athlete. His family had been living at the RCAF base Clinton for the previous 3 years, and his father Dan Truscott was a warrant officer, and his wife Doris was a stay-at-home mom, which was quite common at the time, to their 4 children. And so around 7:25, after chatting a little bit, Lynne had asked Stephen if he would take her on his bike to Highway 8, as there were some horses just outside of town that she wanted to visit. So Lynne hopped up on his handlebars, and they rode down the hill towards Highway 8. On the short journey, they would pass a wooded area known as Lawson's Bush, and they kept going and crossed a set of railway tracks, and after the tracks was a bridge to cross the Bayfield River, and shortly after that, they finally reached Highway 8. This highway would take you to either the town of Clinton or a town called Seaforth. And when they reached the highway about 5 minutes later, at approximately 7:30 p.m., Lynne asked to get off his bike. Stephen knew he had to be home at 8:30 to babysit his younger brother and sister, Bill and Barbara, so they said their goodbyes and he headed back down the road the same way that they came. Before getting too far, he looked back at Lynne and saw her standing next to the highway with her thumb sticking out as if she was hitchhiking. He then saw her get into a 1959 gray Chevrolet with a yellow license plate or bumper sticker. He specifically remembered this vehicle because that year they had changed the exterior of the vehicle, and there was now large fenders sticking out of the side of the vehicle, and the headlights looked like cat eyes. Stephen made it back to the park with just under an hour to spare before he had to be home. He saw his older brother Kenny, who was also at the park, and they chatted for a short while before he swapped bikes with him and Stephen biked his way home. Upon getting home at about 8:25, his mother was outside speaking with a neighbor and left Stephen to watch his younger siblings as planned. Back at the Harper home, Lynne's parents were getting concerned as she hadn't come back from wherever she had gone to. And around 11:20 p.m., when Lynne still hadn't returned, her father Leslie reported her missing to the RCAF guardhouse. Leslie and Shirley were afraid that Lynne may have tried to hitchhike to her grandmother's house in Port Stanley, which was 136 kilometers or 84 miles, and Ontario Provincial Police were contacted shortly after, but their reports stated that Lynne was a runaway and was probably hitchhiking. Back in 1959, hitchhiking wasn't as taboo as it is today. People weren't quite aware of the dangers yet, and it was done more frequently. And at the time Lynne went missing, she was described as a petite brunette with a small scar on her lip. and she was wearing a turquoise shirt with a white blouse and a necklace with an RCAF crest. That night, Leslie and Shirley were hopeful that Lynne would turn back up. They left the front door unlocked, the porch light on, and thought for sure they'd wake up in the morning to their daughter in her bed, apologizing for the night prior. Early the next morning, Lynne still had not returned, and so around 7:30 a.m., Leslie drove to the RCAF office to ask around if anyone had seen Lynne. When he asked Dan Truscott, Dan told Leslie that he hadn't seen her but to swing by the house and ask the kids, as they were at the park in the evening and probably saw her. Leslie didn't waste any time. He headed over to the Truscott house to find Stephen finishing up his breakfast. When asked, Stephen said, yeah, he did see Lynne. He actually biked her to Highway 8 and saw her get into a 1959 gray Chevrolet. Immediately, Lynne knew something was wrong. She hadn't made it to her grandmother's, if that's where she was going, and that should have been the only place she would hitchhike to. He thanked Stephen for the information and headed back home. He told Shirley what he found out, and together they started calling every single one of Lynne's friends that they could think of to ask if she had slept over or if any of them had seen her that morning. Leslie then contacted the Ontario Provincial Police to update them and immediately started looking into Stephen Truscott. During the investigation, the OPP asked Stephen's father if he would bring him in to be questioned. Since he was the last person to see Lynne, his father did as he was told. He wanted to help, so he picked up Stephen from school and brought him to the station. Hopefully, Stephen would have the answers to be able to lead investigators to Lynne. So they did the interview and Stephen returned to school, but everyone just assumed that Lynne had hitchhiked. But where was she? Around 5 p.m., the OPP investigators went back to the Truscott home to pick up Stephen and his mother Doris. They'd like Stephen to show them where he was exactly with Lynne last. Stephen walked them through his exact steps. He was biking at the park, ran into Lynne. She said she wanted to go see the horses. She hopped up on his handlebars. They rode down the hill, past Lawson's Bush, across the tracks, over the bridge, and to the highway, which is where she got off his bike. While he was biking away, he looked back, saw her standing by the road with her thumb out, and then get into the 1959 gray Chevy. He returned to the park, swapped bikes with his brother, then went home to babysit. That was it. The next day, June 11th, the investigation led investigators to questioning more students about what they saw at the park, if they were there, what Lynne was like, what Stephen was like, exactly what they saw. Meanwhile, 250 people began searching for Lynne all over the RCAF base Clinton. A group of searchers started with Lawson's Bush. While searching this area, they stumbled upon something that would change this investigation from a missing persons case, possible kidnapping, to a murder. 2 days after 12-year-old Lynne Harper went missing, investigators found her body, and it was way worse than they thought. She was laying on her back in the Lawson woods. Her blouse was still on her right arm, ripped, tied around her neck, and appeared to be soaked with blood. She was naked and appeared to have been sexually assaulted. It also looked like the killer broke 3 branches off a nearby tree and laid them horizontally over top of Lynne's body. The rest of her clothes were folded neatly, including her rolled-up socks, zippered shorts, and placed beside her body. This scene looked set up. Initially, police didn't believe this was where it all happened. There was no shoe prints, no signs of a struggle, no disturbed ground. a tiny bit of blood on the ground that didn't match how soaked her shirt was. As word spread about the body, the searchers decided best to start laying their jackets over top of her in order to shield the public from the horrific scene and give the family some dignity. People were unable to find any fingerprints, as well as there was no testing done on the jackets that were placed over top of her body. They found old vehicle and bike tire tracks, and were on the lookout for anyone with scratches on their arms, face, or neck. The autopsy of Lynne showed that her cause of death was strangulation. The pathologist also removed her stomach contents, placed them in a jar, and looked at the contents through bright light. He then decided that a normal stomach should have emptied within 2 hours of eating. With the contents left in the jar, and knowing that her family ate supper around 5:30 p.m., he decided that her time of death was between 7:15 and 7:45. This aligns with the timeline and points to the time when Lynne and Stephen were together, which led police to latch on to this theory. The next day, June 12th, Stephen was pulled out of class again and taken to the station for more intense questioning, without parents or a lawyer. Apparently, another student had said that Stephen asked them to go on a date to Lawson's Bush that same night that Lynne went missing. But when he showed up at their home just before 6 p.m., they weren't home. The police believed this enraged Stephen, and he used Lynne as the replacement. They tried and tried to get Stephen to slip on his story, but he stuck to his guns. When Stephen didn't show up after school, his parents started to worry, and when night came around 9:30 p.m. and he still wasn't home, his family was on a hunt. I'm sure that everyone was still on edge from 12-year-old Lynne going missing and now being found murdered. And now their child hasn't come home from school. You would automatically think the worst. Luckily, someone tipped off Daniel Truscott as to where his son was, and he was able to join them in the interrogation. This is where I'm thankful for all of the knowledge I've learned from all of the crime podcasts and shows. Stephen was never under arrest, so they could have left at any moment instead of letting them intimidate and mess with his memory for hours and hours. But Daniel chose to stay, and maybe that's because most people try to see the good. They want to help. They want to trust that the system would never allow an innocent person to be locked away for years. But boy, is that wrong. Police brought a doctor into the interview room to look over Stephen, to which the doctor found no scratch marks or bruises anywhere. However, they did find lesions on Stephen's penis, which the doctor decided was a result of raping Lynne. On June 13th, Stephen was officially charged with 12-year-old Lynne Harper's murder. Now, capital murder was still a punishment, so if Stephen was charged as an adult and found guilty, he could face being hanged. The thing with this theory is, how is a 14-year-old able to fight and hold down a 12-year-old without getting any scratches, as well as the strength needed to strangle someone for 4 to 5 minutes to ensure death? I want you to take one of your hands and wrap it around the forearm of your other hand and squeeze as tight as you can while I tell you a couple things. Lynne's memorial service was on the 13th at the RCAF base. She was buried in her Girl Guides uniform, and her honor guards were over 30 other Girl Guides. Now, if you're still squeezing, that was only 13 seconds. I don't think you understand the amount of rage and strength a person needs to follow through with strangling somebody after fighting to control them. And remember when I told you that Lynne's clothes were folded neatly beside her body and her socks were even rolled? To me, that screams military, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, Stephen's trial started on September 16th, 1959, and the courts decided that he should be tried as an adult. Stephen pled not guilty, and the trial lasted 15 days and had over 70 witnesses. Their argument was that Stephen and Lynne only made it to the bush instead of the highway, and that's when he would have been able to overpower her, rape, and murder her before he made his way back to the school and was acting completely normal. We don't always know how we're going to react in times of crisis, but you would think that as a young kid, if he had committed a crime so heinous, he would have been out of breath, full of adrenaline, a little rattled, and showing signs of an attack. Stephen's defense stated that the timeline was so small, and they had a doctor that was familiar with tons of sexual assault cases, testify in court that the description of the lesions on Stephen's penis would be highly unlikely caused by forced sexual penetration. In this doctor's years of experience, it was very rare that a penis was injured during rape. And when it does happen, it's usually a tear to the frenum. After all of this, there was zero physical evidence that Stephen was ever at the crime scene, and not one single thing tied Stephen to Lynne's murder. On September 30th, 1959, the jury found Stephen Truscott guilty of the murder of 12-year-old Lynne Harper and was sentenced to death by hanging. Stephen's face turned white as a ghost as he heard this, and he started to cry. His family was absolutely horrified. The fact that a 14-year-old boy could be charged with murder and sentenced to death by hanging, all from circumstantial evidence, was eye-opening. Some people disagreed, but most people trusted in the court system. If the courts said you were guilty, you had to have done the crime. They would never make a mistake. The family appealed this, but it was initially denied. However, the federal courts stepped in and changed Stephen's sentence to life in prison. This was a relief to Stephen and his family, as it gave them more time to fight. After his sentencing hearing, he was sent to a youth penitentiary called Ontario Training School for Boys, and there he was described as a model prisoner. He stayed out of trouble, played sports, and learned woodworking. When he turned 18, he was transferred to an adult penitentiary, where he worked with machines and continued to be a model prisoner. In 1966, a journalist named Isabelle Laborde published a book called The Trial of Stephen Truscott that attacked the, quote, rapid police investigation and trial, calling into question a justice system that many people considered infallible, unquote. The book was popular and led to a 2-week hearing in 1966 that was held in front of the Supreme Court of Canada. This caused the pathologist to go back on his word, saying his original report was too specific, and it's possible she died anywhere between 7:15 p.m. and 7:15 a.m. the next morning, a 12-hour window. There was also a couple that was initially interviewed 2 days after Lynne went missing and said that they saw a young girl fitting Lynne's description who was hitchhiking along Highway 8. However, because the couple agreed that it was near dark when they saw this girl, police decided that it wasn't Lynne and there was no need to look into this tip. As 7:15 p.m. in June, it's still light out. It doesn't get dark until about 9:30-10 p.m. If they knew back then what we know now about memory, would they still have the same thoughts? However, both of these were never given to the court nor the defense. This document did not come forward until years later. What did come forward during the hearing was that when the pathologist initially assessed Lynne's stomach contents, it had been sent to another laboratory for confirmation, to which the police interpreted that it was a definite confirmation, and so the lab came forward saying that it was never a definitive confirmation of the timeline. Another doctor came forward saying that it wasn't a reliable way to determine time of death as every body digests differently. Again, another medical doctor came forward saying that the skin lesions found on Stephen were most likely a skin condition rather than trauma. And there was also the thought that what happened to Lynne did not happen at the scene. She was most likely moved due to the lack of semen and lack of evidence, including footprints, signs of a struggle, ripped out hairs, and blood. Stephen Truscott had the opportunity to testify in front of the Supreme Court. However, he was nervous and didn't remember certain details and times, although the bulk of his story was the exact same. He picked up Lynne, biked down the hill, past Lawson's Bush, across the tracks, across the bridge. Then she was hitchhiking and he saw her get into the 1959 gray Chevy. I can't imagine how he felt being up there. The last time, I'm sure he was certain and had faith in the justice system, and that this time would bring up all of those old memories, the trauma of his friend being murdered and raped, and the police and the community blaming him. There was also debris under Lynne's nails that did not link Stephen to Lynne's murder. The hope that this trial brought was quickly diminished when the Supreme Court ruled that the evidence was enough to keep Stephen behind bars. Let me remind you, the circumstantial evidence was enough to keep Stephen behind bars, and the original verdict would continue. A second time, this country's justice system failed Stephen Truscott. He may have started with just his divorced parents and Isabel on his side, but after this second trial, the public started to push back and side with Stephen. Because Stephen's case went from the death penalty to life in prison, the minimum he had to serve was 10 years. With no incidents in jail and being a model prisoner, he was successfully paroled on October 21st, 1969, at 24 years old. The second trial sparked the interest of a young woman named Marlene. She read through his entire case and decided that Stephen was not guilty. When he was paroled, she reached out to him, and the two fell in love quickly. Getting married in 1970, they changed their last name to live under the radar and moved to the other side of the country, residing in British Columbia. A few years later, they moved back to Ontario, living in Guelph, where Stephen worked as a millwright. In 1971, Marlene gave birth to a healthy baby girl named Leslie, and another book about Stephen was released, called The Stephen Truscott Story by Bill Trent, which 8 years later was revised to Who Killed Lynne Harper. By then, Marlene gave birth to another healthy baby boy named Ryan. In 1979, Stephen's dad, Daniel Truscott, died of cancer. And then in 1980, Marlene gave birth one last time to another healthy baby boy named Devin. Stephen tried his hardest to stay under the radar from the media, since he remained a paroled, convicted murderer. Although his neighbors and coworkers had figured out who he was, they remained respectful and kept it to themselves. Thankfully, when the 1990s came around, DNA became a thing that could be tested. And in the late 1990s, DNA was used to exonerate 2 convicted felons in Canada. One we talked about in episode 5, titled Christine Jessup. The man was Guy Paul Morin, and the other a man named David Milgaard, which I will do an episode about this one day, because I believe the murder occurred a few blocks away from my great-grandmother's house, and there's something about a wallet being found. I'll have to ask my family again. But anyway, Stephen was aware of these cases and became involved with a nonprofit called the Association and Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, which is now known as Innocence Canada. This nonprofit began the process of getting the DNA from Lynne Harper's case. However, they found out that all of the evidence from this case had been destroyed years prior. This gave them no choice but to request all of the documents from the case so they could go over them with fresh eyes. There's a show on CBC called The Fifth Estate, and they too started conducting their own investigation into Stephen Truscott's innocence. It aired in March of 2000 and was the first time that Stephen was ever interviewed on camera. He was 55 years old, and in this interview, Stephen is asked why it's so important that you guys, as a family, keep pursuing this. To which Stephen responds, quote, "I want to see justice done. Justice has not been done, not to the Harper family and not to my family. So I mean for both families, that's all I want. After 40 years, I don't think that's too much to ask," unquote. This documentary highlights a potential suspect, a sergeant who is a known sexual offender and alcoholic who worked at RCAF until 1957 when he was transferred to a nearby base about an hour away, but he frequently came back to Clinton. He had 2 previous convictions of indecent exposure, and 3 weeks before Lynne's murder, he tried to lure a 10-year-old girl into his car with the promise of new underwear. But that case was dismissed for lack of evidence. After Lynne's murder, he was hospitalized for severe anxiety. Could it be a guilty conscience? Maybe. He was also a suspect for being a child molester in a car that was trying to pick up young girls in 1960. Alcoholism killed him in 1975, so we may never know justice or the truth. On May 16, 2000, after all other efforts to prove Stephen's innocence failed, lawyers from what's now known as Innocence Canada filed a request to review the case. With the surplus of support from the community, Stephen began using his last name again and proudly wore the last name Truscott. He said in an interview that he wanted his kids to have the family name. In the spring of 2004, there was a 700-page document submitted to the Court of Appeal in order for Stephen's case to be reviewed. In April of 2006, Lynne Harper's body was exhumed in hopes of finding DNA evidence to exonerate Stephen. However, due to the condition of her body, they weren't able to obtain any sufficient DNA to be able to test. On June 19, 2006, the Ontario Court of Appeal conducted a hearing that lasted about 3 weeks. They argued that using stomach contents shouldn't have been used to determine a precise time of death, as it could take up to 4 hours for a stomach in that age group to empty. There are also many other factors that affect someone's digestive system. It should have only ever been used to say that yes, you believe the person died at least so many hours after their last meal, not down to a 30-minute window. A friend of the girl that said she had a date with Stephen earlier that night that Lynne went missing testified that she had told her she initially lied to police about it because she wanted Stephen's attention. The OPP also admitted to not looking into any other suspects after finding out about Stephen, which blew the judges away that officers who are supposed to protect and serve put all of their energy into an innocent 14-year-old boy when they were all aware of the pedophiles and sexual offenders running around the Clinton base. As well as Lynne Harper's murder appeared to have been done by somebody with experience, not a first-timer 14-year-old. A doctor even went on the stand stating that he teaches his students that any doctor narrowing down to fractions of time of death is either uninformed or incompetent. Another doctor even examined evidence and came to the conclusion that there is a high chance that Lynne actually died on the 10th, the day after she went missing. On August 28, 2007, the Ontario Court of Appeal released their verdict. Quote, "In a decision released today, the court unanimously holds that the conviction of Mr. Truscott was a miscarriage of justice and must be quashed. The court further holds that the appropriate remedy in this case is to enter an acquittal. The court thus orders that Mr. Truscott should stand acquitted of the murder of Lynne Harper, unquote. This verdict was huge for Stephen and the Truscott family. He could be a completely free man and no longer be considered or carry the burden of being a murderer. The government of Ontario later issued an apology on July 7, 2008. They announced that they would be rewarding Stephen Truscott $6.5 million in compensation for emotional suffering. The family decided to use some of the money to start the Truscott Initiative in Justice Studies at the University of Guelph. In 2012, at the age of 67, Stephen was diagnosed with prostate cancer and underwent treatment, but beat cancer 2 years later in 2014. Stephen and his wife Marlene were grandparents and living their life privately. Lynne's parents, Leslie and Shirley, went on to have a hard time dealing with healing due to Lynne's story constantly being in the media. Shirley later died of a heart attack, and Leslie spoke with the media and said that they always thought Stephen was guilty, so when he was acquitted, their whole world turned upside down. With one family celebrating and the other opening old wounds, sadly the Harper family may never know who hurt their little girl. If you have any thoughts, insights, or theories about the Lynne Harper case, I'd love to hear from you. You can follow me on Instagram at missing.murder.macchiatos. I also have it linked in the description below, along with the sources that I used for this episode. I post pictures weekly that go along with every episode, so please don't forget to like, follow, share if you enjoyed the episode, and leave a 5-star review if you liked it that much, so I can continue to make content and spread awareness about these cases. Remember, every cup of coffee can be a moment of connection and conversation, so let's keep the discussions alive. Join me next week as we dive into another chilling tale, because the truth is often darker than we imagine. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and keep sipping. Bye for now!